The world was once loud with cities filled with voices, laughter machines, and ambition, but now there was only silence. The kind of silence that carried the weight of ashes and smoke and lost skies, that used to glow blue now hung heavy and rust-colored. Clouds lit by fires that never stopped burning, and the ground beneath them cracked open in places where weapons from beyond the stars had torn the land apart. What was once called Earth was now a graveyard of dreams. It began not with a declaration or warning, but with lights in the sky moving too fast to be human, and with a hum in the air that made the oceans shiver. The invaders came not to conquer but to cleanse. Their technology was pure in form and function, cold and perfect, the opposite of human machines. They never spoke. They only observed, calculated, and acted. Cities were erased not in battles, but in silent flashes, one after another, until maps no longer mattered. They were called the Varn, a name taken from intercepted signals. But no one ever truly saw them up close. Those who did never lived long enough to describe them. They moved like shadows in metal armor, their drones sweeping across continents, dropping spores that turned air into poison and water into acid within 3 months. The numbers started to drop. In 6 months, entire nations vanished. In 9 months, over 3 billion were dead. Not soldiers, not rebels, not heroes, but children, mothers, doctors, farmers, people who once believed tomorrow was a promise. What was left of the world scattered like dust across mountain bunkers, frozen wastelands, and forgotten shelters under the earth. In one such facility, far beneath the ice where no satellite could see and no drone could hear, a group of survivors worked. In silence, they were not leaders or chosen ones, just humans who refused to kneel. Among them were a strategist with a burned face, a woman who once built satellites, a pilot who couldn't fly anymore, and a boy who had never seen the sun without smoke. They gathered every day in a dim room lined with black screens, broken servers, and blinking lights. They weren't trying to win a war, they were just trying to make the enemy bleed. And in the heart of that bunker, hidden behind thick metal doors sealed for decades, was something ancient, something created in fear and locked away in shame. It was called Protocol Black. Cell. No one had spoken that name aloud in years, not since the world still had laws, and the world still had presidents. The strategist pressed his hand against the biometric scanner, his voice flat and hollow as he said the activation phrase. The others stood behind him, eyes heavy but alert, not because they believed this would work, but because they had nothing else left. The doors opened slowly, releasing a breath of air that hadn't moved in generations. Inside were long chambers, filled with cylindrical tanks covered in frost. Within those tanks were shapes, tall, wide, silent things, with skin that shimmered like oil and eyes that glowed even while they slept. These were not aliens, not machines, not clones. They were human at their core, twisted and reforged into weapons beyond understanding, born of rage, bred in silence, made to feel no pain and show no fear. They had been created for a war that never happened, locked away when governments grew afraid of what they made, and forgotten when peace was declared. But peace had died 3 billion times, and now there was nothing left to fear. The woman with the satellite hands walked past the tanks, her fingers brushing the glass. She read the data glowing on the panel's heart. Steady voice, calm, as she confirmed the creatures were still alive, still dormant, still waiting. All they needed was a signal, a spark to ignite them. The pilot connected the uplink, routed the commands, and adjusted the target coordinates. The boy just watched, eyes wide, not in terror, but all because he knew whatever was in those tanks was made for this moment. They didn't vote, they didn't debate. They pressed the button. For a second, nothing happened, and then every screen in the bunker went black. Every light flickered, the walls shook as something deep below roared, not with a voice, but with a pressure that could be felt in the bones. The tanks drained one by one, and the monsters awoke, not screaming, not thrashing. They simply opened their eyes and stood still, like statues carved from war itself, their breath like steam, their fists clenched without reason, only purpose. The strategist looked at the woman. She nodded without a word. He turned to the pilot, who gave a quiet signal, and then monsters began to move, walking through corridors designed to hold them, but never command them. They were going Topside toward the hangars were ships weighted old rusty, half-broken aircraft built by humans, now modified for monsters outside. The bunker the wind howled through ice and fire and cracked stone. A Varn drone passed over, scanning the area, and saw nothing, just cold and death. As it turned away, a sudden spike of movement appeared below, and then the ground exploded in a burst of metal and bone and fury. The monsters climbed out one by one, their bodies too massive to be real, their eyes locked on the sky above where the enemy waited. No words were spoken, no prayers were offered, no mercy was left. The monsters were loose, and for the first time since the war began, the Varn had something to fear. They thought they had ended the war by killing the people, but they didn't realize that what they killed was only the first version of humanity, the version that hoped that reason would win and kindness would be enough. Now they faced something else, something deeper and older, something that was made not to live but to end. As the first monster leapt into the sky, riding fire toward a Varn fortress, the strategist spoke softly to no one in particular. If we are going down, they are going with us, and somewhere deep within the earth, the rest of the monsters stirred. Snow melted under the feet of the monsters as they marched across the scorched tundra, steam rising from their backs like breath from giants. Their bodies, crafted in ancient laboratories, now pulsed with raw energy. Their muscles, layered with fibers that never tired, their senses tuned to frequencies no human could understand. No hesitation, no confusion, only mission and instinct, guiding every move like they had waited for this day since the beginning of time. The survivors inside the underground base watched the launch feed in silence, the screens filled with blurred images of fast movement and fractured sky. The monsters had taken to the air, boarding rusted warships and drop pods that had not flown in years. The machines obeyed them, as if recognizing something deeper than programming. The link between metal and monster forged long ago, now reawakened by desperation. Each monster was different in form, some with wide shoulders and arms like tree trunks, others with blades growing from their limbs or glowing lines across their chests. No two were the same, yet all were born from the same purpose, created by human hands in secret labs, where ethics were sacrificed for victory and mercy was locked away with the blueprints. Their blood was mixed with beasts, their minds wired to fight, their hearts engineered to never stop. Mark stood behind the control console, eyes fixed on the signal data, watching red dots vanish from the map one after another. Each dot a Varn outpost now gone, wiped from the earth, not by missiles, not by armies, but by living weapons that never asked questions. The monsters didn't need guns. They were the guns, their bodies, stronger than steel, their strikes louder than thunder. They moved like storms across the broken cities, reclaiming nothing, only destroying what did not belong. Lila tracked their movement across the eastern continents, her hands trembling as she realized how fast they were adapting. The monsters had never seen Varn technology, yet they now used parts of fallen drones for armor and tools, learning the enemy like predators studying prey, their minds not just violent but calculating and aware. They did not speak, but their actions showed unity, purpose, coordination without words. In one ruined city, once called Ryan, a group of survivors emerged from a collapsed metro tunnel, watching the monsters pass through streets that used to echo with life. The survivors didn't run, they stood still, unsure if these beasts were friend or foe. One monster paused, turned toward them, its glowing eyes meeting theirs before it continued on. Without harm, not protectors, not allies, just something worse for the enemy than death. The Varn had always believed in clean war. They deployed silent death from orbit, or released machines that moved with mathematical precision. They had never prepared for chaos, for rage, made real for pain that walked with fists and fire. Now their formations broke, their machines failed to predict, their drones turned to dust under claws too fast to capture, and they began to retreat. Not because they feared loss, but because they tasted fear. Adam watched the skies through the cracked dome of an old observation post where he once trained to fly jets, now grounded by radiation. He saw a pod burst from the clouds and crash into a Varn carrier spinning in flames before it hit the ocean. The monster had guided it with no instruments, only instinct, aiming for the heart Of the enemy with the accuracy of hatred centuries, DP smiled not because of victory, but because something finally fought back with more than strategy. It fought with fury deep. Inside the mountain vaults where more monsters rested the awakening. Continued chambers lighting one after another, as if something inside them sensed the war had come. The signals moved through old wires, across abandoned satellites, triggering codes no one remembered writing. More monsters began to stir their hibernation. Interrupted by the call of blood and sky and fire, their creators long dead, their purpose still alive. Boy, who had never seen sunlight, stood near the hatch of the observation room, staring at the horizon where the clouds glowed red with distant explosions. He didn't speak, but inside his chest, something stirred, not fear, not hope, something else, something heavier. The monsters did not frighten him. They felt like truth, like the answer to a question humanity had been afraid to ask for too long. What happens when kindness fails? What remains when peace is no longer an option? In a sealed room buried deeper than the rest, a single monster remained untouched, its tank larger, its systems locked with codes. The others didn't share. Mark stood before it, staring at the thing inside, not moving, not awake, but more massive, more still than anything he had seen. The glass frosted over again, as if it breathed in sleep. He reached for the keypad, then stopped, unsure if waking this one was part of the plan or the end of it. Back in orbit, the Varn Council transmitted its first message since the war began. No words, only a frequency that pulsed across all open channels. A sound like mourning, like confusion, like regret, but not surrender. They had come to destroy, but they had not expected resistance to take this shape. Not soldiers, not weapons, but monsters made by the very hands they tried to erase, and now the Varn were unsure if they were still in control. Leela recorded the behavior patterns, uploading the latest data into the old Earth Defense archives, hoping someone one day would understand what they had done. Not just activated war machines, but awakened something deeper. The monsters were not mindless. They were changing faster than any algorithm could follow, some even stopping to observe Varn bodies, dissecting parts before moving on. They were becoming more than they were built for. They were becoming something new. She looked at the footage of a monster placing a broken human child gently beside a bunker door before vanishing into the smoke without harming anyone. Not mercy, perhaps, just memory. Something in them still remembered where they came from, maybe not with thought, but with instinct, some fragment of humanity buried under layers of engineered rage. The survivors gathered in small groups, watching the skies, listening to the ground, waiting for signs of movement. Not all were thankful, not all trusted what had been unleashed, but none denied that the monsters were winning where everything else had failed. They had taken the enemy's silence and returned it with screams. They had taken the loss of billions and answered it with vengeance that could not be reasoned with. The monsters were not summoned by hope or faith or unity. They were called by death, and they answered not for humanity's glory, but because the fire had reached them too. Because when the world ended, they did not ask who was right, they only knew who remained. Smoke covered the lands like a second sky, thick and endless, hiding what once were cities and now were only scars of war. Blackened trees stood like skeletons. Broken highways stretched into nowhere, but between this silence and ruin, the monsters moved, their shadows flowing over shattered ground, their forms blending with flame and ash. They were no longer just tools of destruction. They were becoming something else, something more alive than the machines they fought, and more deadly than the war that birthed them. Inside the central command shelter deep beneath the mountain, the surviving humans watched the screens with quiet disbelief. Every hour brought new reports of Varn forces falling, not just in numbers, but in strategy. Their tactics growing weaker, their responses slower, as if their minds could no longer calculate what they faced. The monsters were not repeating patterns, they were rewriting them, changing after every battle, adapting to terrain, to enemies, to weapons. Without command, without hesitation, Mark sat at the main console, his face lit by flickering monitors. Data streaming faster than he could follow. The monsters had begun forming units, not a sign, but chosen. Their movement showed purpose, not randomness. Formations began to appear across the maps, not organized by humans, but built by the creatures themselves. They no longer followed the simple hunt and destroy directives. Their paths circled key targets. They surrounded zones, they pushed Varn forces into traps in the labs. Lila ran simulation overlays, comparing old combat data with current battlefield behavior. What she saw was impossible. The monsters had increased their efficiency by 70% in just 2 days' movements, once instinctual. Now looked like strategy. Coordination between them occurred faster than communication could explain. No words, no signals, yet they moved like one shared mind, learning through action. Learning from death. One field camera showed a monster picking up a fallen Varn weapon, its clawed fingers tapping over the controls. Slowly then, with strange precision, it turned the weapon toward the sky and fired directly into a passing drone. Striking at mid-flight, the creature dropped the gun immediately and turned away, but the data was clear. It had recognized a function, it had tested a theory, and it had succeeded. Datum stood in the Western observation post, watching a new type of drop pod being built by the monsters themselves using broken parts from destroyed carriers, bones of downed ships twisted into frames welded by heat from their own hands. These pods were smaller, faster, not meant for carrying, but for crashing directly into enemy command points. No one told them to make these, no one showed them how. They just began, and they did not stop. Across the ruined plains in the north, a group of monsters was seen standing in a wide circle, surrounding a single crater where a Varn ship had fallen. They did not attack, they did not move for hours. Just stood still, eyes glowing through the dust as if studying or perhaps remembering. The Varn did not attempt to reclaim the site. Instead, they burned the entire zone from orbit, erasing both the ship and the monsters in a wall of fire. But no scream was heard, no retaliation came, only silence. And then more monsters appeared days later, walking calmly through the flames unharmed. Back at the mountain bunker, the boy who never saw sunlight stood near the power core, staring at the old metal door that led to the deepest vault, the last chamber still unopened. The one Mark refused to speak about. The boy didn't touch the door, but his hand hovered near it, as if something called to him, not with sound, but with memory, as if part of him remembered something that was never his. Mark met with Lila in the strategy room, both watching the recent footage of a new figure among the monsters, larger than the others, slower in movement, but followed by all who came near it. The others stepped aside when it passed. They moved only after it moved. It gave no commands, but its presence shifted everything around it. The soldiers called it the Alpha, not because of orders, but because of instinct. Even among monsters, something had risen to lead. Lila adjusted the filter on the image and found something that made her stop. The Alpha's skin had markings not present in the others. Patterns shaped like old human code symbols used in early bioengineering tests, symbols that were never included in the final batches. This one was from the first generation, a prototype never meant to wake, buried beneath all others, never supposed to rise, and yet here it was, walking through fire, leading without speaking. Varn attempted a coordinated strike targeting 5 major hive zones where monsters had gathered in clusters, massive energy weapons deployed from orbit. Cutting lines through the Earth's surface, the attack erased everything in its path for miles, but within minutes new movement appeared from outside zones. Monsters who were not in the target area rushed to the zone, surrounded the craters, and began dragging pieces of fallen comrades back to hidden chambers. Layla studied the recovered footage from these sites and found something stranger than all before. The monsters were not just burying their dead, they were analyzing them, testing parts, stitching together functions. They were learning through death and building from it, not in sadness, not in honor, but in something more primal, something closer to evolution. Inside the communications wing, Adam intercepted a strange burst, not from Varn systems, not from human tech. It came from somewhere deep beneath the earth. A repeating pulse-like heartbeat, mixed with code unlike anything they used before. It matched no known language, yet every monster nearby shifted the moment it appeared. Their bodies tensed, their eyes lit brighter as if summoned by a voice without words, and they moved in the same direction at once, not toward a battle, but toward the vault. The vault that had not been opened since the beginning. The vault that held what even the monsters feared. Mark stood before it once again, unsure if the time had come, unsure if he was ready to see what was inside. The boy stood beside him, quiet, but his eyes glowing faintly like the creatures above ground. Mark entered the code. The door hissed as old gas escaped. The walls groaned from pressure, long sealed, and the door opened. Into darkness a single tank stood in the center, surrounded by silence, no lights, no movement, only the sound of power returning to the chamber. And then within the tank the shape began to shift, muscles tightening, lights flickering across its skin. This was not just a monster, it was the seed, the beginning of the program, the firstborn of rage and sorrow, made in the days when hope had already died outside. The base, the Alpha, paused, turned slowly toward the mountain, as if it felt the awakening, and all monsters across the continent stopped moving. For a breathless second, the sky grew quiet, the air too still, and then as one, they began to march toward the mountain, not to destroy, not to protect, but to witness what was rising from the forgotten core of Earth's last war. Beneath the mountain where the cold never faded and time stood still, the vault door stood wide open, and from its shadow emerged the first creation, not the strongest, not the largest, but the oldest, the one made before the others, when humanity still believed it could control power, born of desperation, not logic. This one was made in silence during the earliest days, when the stars first warned of incoming war. Its body moved slow, not because it was weak, but because it remembered every pain, every experiment, every failure. It had been through all of it before the others. Ever breathed. Mark stepped back as the chamber lights struggled to stay on the air around the first creation. Felt different, not heavy but deep, like something that did not belong in the present, but had forced itself into it. Leela stared at it, not with fear, but with understanding. Her fingers hovered over her data pad, but she knew no numbers would define what stood before her. This was not just another weapon, it was the root, the source, the memory of Earth's greatest sin, now walking again with purpose above ground. The monsters began to change their formations, their direction, their speed. No signal had gone out, no words were spoken, but they all turned toward the mountain, following an invisible thread, pulling them back, not like soldiers returning to base, but like stars aligning around gravity. They moved over deserts, over oceans, over burning cities, without rest, without sound, drawn to the core, where something older than all of them had awakened. In orbit, the Varn watched the shift in silence, their ships scanning the surface, their commanders speaking in codes and frequencies that no longer mattered. They saw the patterns too, the unity, the momentum, something they could not calculate. They sent a message to Earth, a broadcast across all channels, not of surrender, but warning. They demanded the immediate deactivation of all biological weapons, or they would end the planet completely. No response came, only silence and shifting power beneath the crust of the world they tried to erase. Mark received the message. He read it without reaction, then passed it to Lila, who looked at it once, then turned away. There would be no negotiation, not after 3 billion voices had vanished in smoke. The time for mercy had passed, and what remained was not revenge. It was something colder. It was resolution. Adam entered the K chamber, his face marked by ash from the last drone strike on the far outpost. He nodded toward the first creation, then asked if it could be controlled. No one answered, because the question had no meaning anymore. The first creation stepped toward the core chamber, where the old systems of Earth's last defense network still blinked on and off. The cables recognized its presence. The doors opened without command. The machines obeyed, not out of programming, but memory. This was the key, the one they were all built from, and it had returned to finish what humanity never had the courage to complete. It connected itself to the network without resistance, and the system lit up across the globe. Satellites once lost, now reactivated. Signal towers once silent, now screamed to life. Across the battlefields of Earth, monsters stopped, and then received something, not a command, not a message, but a memory, a flood of images, data, emotions too large to be explained with words. It was not control, it was unity, not orders, but purpose. They saw what the first creation had seen. They felt what it had endured, and they understood What they had to do this was not about survival anymore. This was about ending the war completely. The Alpha stood in the center of the northern plain, its form dark against the glowing clouds as the others gathered around it, waiting. The sky above burned as Varn ships moved into final attack position, weapons charging, engines roaring, but the ground answered with thunder. The monsters launched themselves into the air, not with ships, but with constructs of their own flesh and stolen metal. They moved like missiles, living weapons wrapped in fury, crashing through the atmosphere into the heart of the Varn fleet in space. Fire bloomed like flowers as the first ships fell. Monsters tore through hulls with claws that burned and teeth that shattered steel. The Varn tried to escape, tried to fight back, but their weapons aimed at logic, not madness, and the monsters were more than madness now. They were evolution, born in failure, reborn in fire, and now unstoppable. The war had changed its language, and the Varn could not read it back. On Earth, the skies opened with light as fragments of ships began to fall. The ground trembled with each impact, and yet no one in the bunker moved. They knew the end was close, not of Earth, not of humanity, but of the invasion that had stolen the sky and buried the stars. The first creation stood still, eyes dim as its thoughts moved through every machine, every monster, every satellite, and finally reached beyond Earth into the enemy command node. The signal was not a word, it was a pulse, and with it came one message, not in language, but in intent. You do not belong. The Varn main vessel exploded in silence from orbit. The signal disrupted the system, imploded. The remaining fleet scattered, but they were no longer organized, no longer guided, only broken fragments of a failed purge, and even those did not escape. The monsters followed them into the void, leaping from falling wreckage, launching from orbiting moons, riding stolen vessels without fear, without return. Earth did not send an army, it sent something worse. On the surface, the survivors emerged from bunkers, shelters, ruins. They looked to the sky and saw no more fire, only fading light and falling dust. They did not cheer. They did not shout, only watched as the monsters began to return, walking slowly across ash and glass. Their eyes dimmed, their bodies marked by the war they had won. Some carried parts of their fallen, some limped, some crawled, but none stopped. They gathered once more around the mountain, their forms casting shadows across what remained of the world. Lila recorded the data quietly, every heartbeat, every pattern. She stored it not for war, but for memory, for the world that would come after, if it ever did. Mark watched the horizon where light began to break through for the first time in months. Not a sun, not yet, but something close to it. Adam walked among the monsters, his hand resting on the shoulder of one that had once torn through steel, now standing still like stone. The boy sat beside the old vault, drawing lines in the dust, not knowing why, only that something inside him had become still. The war was not over in history books or speeches, but it had ended in truth. The enemy had come with logic and precision, and left with scars that would never heal. Earth had answered not with heroes or armies, but with monsters it had buried its worst nightmares. And when the world burned, it dug them out, not to fight for glory, but to make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. Morning returned, but it was not the same as the mornings of the old world. The light did not fall upon towers or highways or crowded cities. It spilled instead across broken mountains, melted bridges, fields once soaked in fire, now quiet, and still silence had returned, but this time it carried no fear. It was not the silence of death, but of peace, one that had cost too much to celebrate, but was here all the same. The monsters no longer moved as they once had, their war over, their purpose fulfilled. They stood at the edges of ruined lands, some gazing into oceans that had swallowed cities, others staring at empty skies where no enemy circled. They did not vanish, they did not sleep, they simply waited as if unsure what came next. Without an enemy, without orders, without rage. They were not creatures of peace, but they understood the world needed time to breathe again. In the heart of the mountain bunker, Mark watched the final systems power down one by one. No more alerts, no more signals, no threats waiting above. The satellites were quiet, the skies clear. The enemy had not returned. and no longer sent messages or weapons or warnings, only silence from space and the void beyond, as if the Varn themselves had accepted what humanity had become and chose never to face it. Again Leela stood at the edge of a ruined plateau holding her recorder. The data she had collected would never be broadcast. It was not meant for war rooms or strategy tables, but for the future, for the ones who would come after, for those born into a world where 3 billion voices had been lost, but not forgotten. She recorded not numbers or coordinates, but memories. The way one monster had stood between a falling ship and a group of children. The way another had carried a wounded dog from burning rubble and placed it gently on a safe ledge before returning to battle. These moments were strange, unexpected, and yet real, as if the monsters had not only been weapons, but something more, something that changed because of the humans they once protected. Adam moved through the rebuilt outpost, helping lift supplies, teaching children how to recognize danger, how to read sky patterns, how to survive in a world that no longer held rules. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the survivors listened, not because he was a leader, but because he had walked beside the monsters and returned. He had seen what they were and still believed in humanity, not in its governments or machines, but in its will to rise again. The boy who never saw sunlight now stood beneath it, not golden or clean, but filtered through clouds and dust. Still it warmed his skin, and for him, that was enough. He did not fear the creatures that watched from the hills, their eyes dim but present. He waved sometimes, and once one of them raised its hand back, not in greeting, perhaps not in understanding, but in something close to recognition. The line between human and monster was not thin, but it was no longer sharp. The first creation remained within the mountain, resting, not sleeping, connected still to the old machines, but silent, no commands, no responses, only presence. Like a heartbeat deep within the earth, steady, unbroken. It had been the beginning, and now it was the anchor, the one piece of the old world that remained unchanged, yet everything around it had moved forward, not into glory, not into triumph, but into something quiet and real. Fields began to grow again where fires once danced, small plants pushing through cracks. In stone, animals returned, some wild, some not understanding what had changed, but feeling that the noise had stopped. Rivers cleared, skies softened, the planet itself breathed slower, as if waiting to see if the peace would last. No machines roamed. No drones circled. The world had not returned to the past. It had become something new. The survivors did not rebuild cities. They formed villages, shelters, outposts built from the bones of old towers, and the hope that maybe smaller was stronger, maybe. Community meant more than control. They shared stories not just of the war, but of what came after, of the way the monsters stood guard over certain ruins and did not let anyone pass, as if protecting sacred ground, not for humans, but for memory, for the fallen who could not return. One child drew a picture of the Alpha standing in the rain while birds rested on its shoulders. The drawing was rough, made with broken charcoal and old paper, but it spread through the settlements, copied, pinned to walls, shared in silence, because it reminded everyone of something simple. The monsters had been made to destroy, but they had chosen to stay, not as rulers, not as hunters, but as watchers, quiet guardians of a world they had once nearly ended. Mark walked through the remains of the old cities, not to count losses, but to witness how far they had come. Trees grew through glass, concrete peeled under moss. Life found a way. Not fast, not easy, but steady. He left markers in the places where mass graves had been dug, simple signs, not with names or numbers, but with symbols for future generations to remember that they stood on ground shaped by fire and ash, but also by survival. Leela's final log entry was short, not because there was little to say, but because there was no way to say all of it. She wrote of the monsters, of the silence of the day. The stars came back into view of the way the earth had screamed and bled, and yet still turned, still offered its sky to those who had not abandoned it. She wrote not to explain, but to pass forward a truth that had no need for answers, only understanding. This was not the end of humanity. It was not the end of the monsters. It was the beginning of something new, a world where the scars of the past remained but no longer bled, where the watchers stood in the distance, not with weapons, but with memory, where the night no longer carried fear and the morning no longer brought morning, and in that new world under clouds that slowly opened and skies that slowly healed, the last creation waited not as a warning, not as a god, but as a reminder that when the world broke, humanity did not bow, it changed, and when change was not enough, it unleashed what could never be caged again, the end.